Hello, beautiful people, and welcome, to Ask Zajef Shenhe edition. I am not going to do another Ask Zajef Ayaka because I don't think enough has changed since my last one. And also because, honestly, I'm sure I'll have to end up talking about Ayaka a decent amount in this video. So let's just get right into it with the first question. First things first, what's her overall place in the meta, pull value, especially compared to the other 3.55 stars, and how much has changed with her in the year since her release, if at all? So Ayaka is a very... not Ayaka, Shenhe, is a very restricted character in the sense that her whole thing, her whole kit, right, her whole deal is she's a unit that buffs cryo damage. Her skill gives a Quill that only activates upon dealing cryo damage. Her burst shreds cryo resistance and also physical resistance, but that doesn't matter quite as much. You gain cryo damage from your burst. That's what she does, right? But what that means is that if you're playing her without playing her with other cryo units, why the fuck would you play her over someone else? Which means that she's mostly played in cryo teams, and because she's cryo herself, then you're getting at least 2 cryo units. Most of the time when you're getting 2 cryo units, you're going to go one of 2 directions, either freeze or melt. With sometimes you'd go mono pyro if it's like a freeze team, but against a non-freezable enemy. So the amount of archetypes in which she can work is pretty small, but she's not restricted in terms of like the unit specifically she can work with. One thing about Shenhe that I think a lot of people often forget is how much worse she becomes in AoE situations. Basically, the Icy Quill can deal damage up to 5 times if you tap it, or 7 times if you hold it. For now, let's simplify it and just talk about the tap. What that means is like, when you're against one enemy, 5 instances of damage will get the Icy Quill buff. When you're against 2 enemies though, it's still gonna be 5 instances of damage, but instances of damage are now spread between those 2 enemies, which means that her damage, same overall, but lower per enemy. She loses value when you are in AoE situations. Now, does that mean that she's bad in AoE? No, because she still has, I mean, it's still a buff, you still get cryo damage, you still get cryo res shred, but it is a factor that can very much influence how good she is in relation to other units in different situations. If you compare her to a unit who's built more for their personal damage, then in many situations what you'll find is that Shenhe would be an upgrade on single target, but a potential downgrade in AoE. As such, and because she's somewhat limited in the teams where she can work, she's a pretty niche character. Niche doesn't mean bad or useless or don't go for her. It just means if you're going to be going for her, it will be for a specific reason. You don't pull for Shenhe because you just want to get a generic strong character. You would pull for Shenhe specifically to improve one of your teams that you know you want to improve, or because you just like her. But focusing on meta reasons, it would be to improve specifically a team that you already have in mind. The thing is, in those teams, she is actually very good, right? She's a good example of a unit that has very, very variable pull value, where on some accounts she'll be f***ing useless, and on some accounts she'll actually be pretty valuable, but who is still just like an overall pretty strong character. Compared to the other 3.55 stars, I don't think the comparison to Dea needs to be said. No, I don't need to keep rubbing salt in the wound. Compared to Sino, I mean, they just inherently do very different things. And then compared to Ayaka, I would say that barring some like very specific situations, Shenhe is not a character that you get if you don't have Ayaka. I think that she can be useful in some very specific Ganyu teams and some very specific Eula teams, as well as some specific Rosaria or Kaeya teams, but you will generally have better options that are more generic and useful for your account for those characters. And mostly, Shenhe is a unit that is used for Ayaka teams. And a good way of conceptualizing the value that Shenhe brings to your account is you can kind of think of her as an Ayaka constellation. That's effectively kind of what she is. Because Ayaka's constellation 1 is dog shit garbage, like if you would be willing to go for one constellation on your Ayaka, then it would be better to go for Shenhe instead. Now the reason why I say that is because A, her impact on Ayaka teams is pretty comparable to an average constellation, but also because personally, I don't feel that what she provides is like very engaging gameplay wise. It's really just make number bigger. So I think that it both kind of acts and feels like a constellation. Now, the main thing about that is that Ayaka team's biggest weakness is unfreezable single target enemies. If the enemies are freezable, Ayaka will will almost never really struggle. But if they're not, then you can actually find yourself in situations where it just does not feel good to play. In those situations, Shenhe is often quite useful because one of the upsides that she has is because her Quill mechanic basically scales proportionally with the amount of units on your team that deal cryo damage, because you give 5 Quills not just to one character but to each character individually, then Shenhe is a bit more valuable in mono cryo teams than a lot of the other cryo units. And when the enemies are not freezable, usually that's the kind of stuff that you want to opt for, which means that one of the biggest impacts that Shenhe has on an account is that it makes the teams where Ayaka can, or the situations where Ayaka can find herself struggling, feel less bad. HOYO has kind of done whatever it could to f with freeze recently, and so if you like playing Ayaka but you feel like you can't play her in a lot of situations because freeze isn't good, then Shenhe would be a unit that you could potentially consider. And how much has changed with her in the year since her release? Honestly, it's actually mainly that. A lot of the recent abysses have been more, I guess, antagonistic to freeze teams, and like that, the idea that freeze teams won't, like, or that freeze won't always be good isn't new, but I would argue that it's a thing that like has happened more recently than back when Shenhe was first released. And when you're in teams where, or when you're in situations where you can freeze without a problem, then I think that Shenhe's value goes down a little bit, because the difference between having Shenhe and not having Shenhe is not as big as it is when you're in situations where freeze doesn't work that well and you're forced to try to consider monocryo options if you don't have the kind of investment that you need. Anyways, all of this to say, I think that her value has increased a very slight amount since her release. Speaking of pull value, is also affected by a player's ownership of willingness to pull for Ayaka, Ganyu, and yes. So obviously, I think that if you don't have Ayaka or Ganyu or Eula, the only reason to pull for Shenhe from a meta perspective would be if you're a Kaeya main who just really, really likes Kaeya, or Rosaria, or Chongyun, or one of the cryo units that you have, right? She's not a meta pull on her own merit, like in a vacuum. To get this out of the way, can you explain how wide the gap between Rosaria, Kaeya, Diona, and Shenhe really is when used as second cryo for the likes of Ayaka, Ganyu, or Eula? So it depends on a lot of factors. The baseline factors are as follows. Shenhe's skill cooldown is longer, which means that if you play your rotations with good swaps, you'll be able to get one additional skill with your Kaeya or Rosaria than you would be able to with your Shenhe. Which means that in many rotations and many situations, her overall energy generation is worse. Compared to Rosaria, Rosaria's skill is a multi-hit, Shenhe's skill is not, which means that Rosaria is more likely to proc Fav. And also, Shenhe doesn't really care that much to build crit, or rather, like, she does care for crit, but crit is not the main stat you're looking for, right? The main thing that you want is attack, and you don't really want to use her on Blizzard, which again can hurt her reliability on Fav procs. Right? I'm starting by listing the things that she's worse at, and then I'll get to the things that she's better at. Obviously, her personal damage is pretty underwhelming, but that's if you don't count the Icy Quill as her personal damage, which like you kind of can make an argument for because it's her motion value, but then it becomes painful. But like basically the amount of damage that you get from your Shenhe's talents, like it's basically it's not AoE damage, or like it doesn't increase linearly in AoE like something like Rosaria's Burst does. In exchange for that, what you get is you get a way to front load damage a lot more easily, and you generally get better like overall team DPS. But yeah, so generally the gap between like in terms of overall team output between Shenhe and Rosaria in cryo teams, if you're playing them in freeze, is around 10% in the best case scenario for Shenhe, and closer to 5, sometimes even 0, like them being basically interchangeable, or if there's enough enemies, potentially even Shenhe being worse. But it's generally like an okay-ish increase. But that's in team DPS, and the value that Shenhe gives sometimes transcends that a little bit, in the sense that because in perfect rotations she gives less energy, you're going to need higher ER on your other cryo character, on your Ayaka for example, but like that's accounted for in team DPS calcs. But if you want to rotate enemies, or you reach the point of investment where you get a lot of HP particles from the enemies just dying very quickly, then that can offset those higher ER requirements without the need to build higher ER on your carry, in which case you'd lose one of the downsides, which would make make the gap larger. And like I said earlier, when instead of going for a freeze team, you ditch the hydro unit and replace it with a third cryo unit, then Shenhe also gains some value because, well, she's buffing one more unit. Building on the last one, just how well does she synergize with each of those 3 cryo carries? Okay, so she synergizes very well with Ayaka because the way that her cooldowns line up, her burst has a 20-second cooldown, which means that if you're playing her in a freeze Ganyu team, you're either going to have to make your Ganyu rotation 20 seconds, or you won't get your burst every rotation. Both of those things you don't really want to do because Ganyu's burst cooldown is 15 seconds, so with 20-second rotation you lose uptime, and therefore DPS, which makes it feel kinda suboptimal. Honestly, like, it's still just a very good team, and she's still a very good option for Ganyu teams, but the unit synergy is a little bit weaker. If you play Melt Ganyu, it can be very difficult to justify being able to use your burst. And if you don't use your burst, well, you don't shred the cryo res, which goes up to 15%, which is like a decent amount. You don't get the 15% cryo damage from her Ascension passive. And so basically, if you're playing her in Melt Ganyu, you get value from Icy Quills, but again, synergistically, if you use your burst in a lot of Melt Ganyu teams, it's going to yoink your melts. Now, funnily enough, there's like 2 different types of Melt Ganyu teams that can actually use this, or that can actually get away with using Shenhe's burst without it really yoinking melts, which are Sunfire Ganyu teams, but if you're playing Sunfire with Shenhe, then you don't have any resistance to interruption, which feels kind of shitty. Or you have Burn Melt Ganyu teams with a source of off-field pyro. If you use Xiangling, don't really have a source of resistance to interruption, but if you use Daya, it can work. Problem here is, you don't have a healer, you don't have Venet's attack buff, it's still not ideal, but it is a thing that can work. Anyways, all in all, generally, because of the way that her burst cryo application can yoink melts from Ganyu, then she also has potential synergy issues. All in all, she's a good support for Ganyu, but it's definitely not like a match made in heaven. Then you look at Eula, and with Eula, she's actually pretty good. The Eula teams that actually focus on Eula's damage, right? Because when you're talking about Eula teams, you kind of have to keep in mind that the Eula teams that perform the best at most people's like expected investment level are the teams where you just have Eula on the team, but you're not really focusing on her, like Eula Hyper Bloom or stuff like that. But putting that out of the way, if you're actually playing a carry Eula team, then most of the stronger ones actually use Shenhe. Whale Eula players very often use Shenhe. Whale Eula teams and even non-Whale Eula teams, just like you'll often find Shenhe being used there because it helps a little bit more with your Eula's ER requirements. And it's not like instead of another cryo unit, it's like on top of another cryo unit. So you end up buffing Eula's cryo damage because, right, it's not a damage percent. I mean, there is a damage percent buff, but it's not just the damage percent buff, it's also like an actual motion value number, which is relevant even when you don't build that much cryo damage percent. Like, it's still useful, it's still helpful, right? So it's not like you're getting a lot, but the fact that Eula can, use the Icy Quills does do something. And you are also having a unit like Rosaria, for example, that is also using the Icy Quills. You're also taking advantage of the Res Shred, which is not just a cryo, it's also the physical. All in all, she's a fine option for Eula teams. She's very replaceable, so she's not a unit that, like, if you want to min-max your Eula team, you need to go for her. But if you like her and you like Eula and you want to play them together, it won't be like playing Chi-Chi, Like, it's not gonna feel like shit. One thing to keep in mind is that against enemies that don't have really high physical resistance, the more Fizz Res Shred you have, the less of it you need. You have pretty heavy percentage diminishing returns on Res Shred, which means that with Eula's built-in Res Shred and Shenhe's Res Shred, in a lot of situations you don't actually need to have Superconduct, so you can play her in Eula teams without needing to use an Electro unit. All in all, it's just a thing to keep in mind. Eula doesn't always need Electro. And often when you're using Shenhe, like, you would want to be using at least one other cryo unit, and because there's no actual Electro shielders, many people would then find themselves playing Electro units that they're not that comfortable playing because they feel like they have to play Electro. You don't have to play Electro, you can play something like Zhongli, right? Just keep that in mind. You can play something like Lila as a fourth option. Or Diona. You're getting another cryo unit to use the Icy Quills. Anyways, her overall synergy with Eula is like not necessarily all that insane, but it is there and it's pretty decent, and she's a pretty good support for her. And then finally, Ayaka. So the thing about Ayaka is that her synergy with Shenhe is actually very, very good. Ayaka doesn't have the issue that Ganyu has of having a 15-second cooldown burst that doesn't line up well with Shenhe, so you'd have to slow down your rotation if you want to use Shenhe's burst in your rotation, because Ayaka's burst is also a 20-second cooldown, so you're already having 20-second rotations. Ayaka's burst is a lot of hits in a short period of time, which means that a thing that you can do is use your E on Shenhe as part of your setup, do your Ayaka burst, swap back to Shenhe, and use your E again, and effectively get all 10 icy quills from 2 uses of your skill being basically all used on Ayaka's burst at the same time, which helps front load damage quite a bit, and which makes it very easy to get 2 elemental skills per rotation. Going back to Ganyu, if you're using her with Mel Ganyu, you'd like to use your hold E, because not only does it buff charge attack, which is Mel Ganyu's main source of damage, but also it has a higher trigger quota, and you're probably not getting 2 E's per rotation anyways. All in all, she synergizes okay with Ganyu, but she's still good with Ganyu just because she's a good cryo buffer. But her main synergy is with Ayaka. Like, that's where the synergy is like the strongest. Would you say she's free-to-play friendly, or is she more so a luxury pull? I mean, she's kind of somewhere in the middle. She's not a unit that's unplayable free-to-play, but as a dedicated support for other 5 stars, she's also not a unit that's very good unless you're putting all of your primo gems in the same basket. So it's not so much that like she's only a whale character, but rather you do need to actually focus your primo gems on pulling units for your cryo teams in order for her to have value. Can I explain how her quills work? Sure. So basically, I don't have Shenhe on my account, so I won't be able to do the greatest showcase of this. When I do damage to an enemy, a lot of stats get taken into consideration. I have my character's attack. If they crit, my character's crit damage, my character's damage bonus for the type of damage they're doing, and the character's motion value, or just like talent multiplier. All of those things are taken together, and they're what decides that when I use my E on a non-crit on Bennett, I do 2054 damage. External buffs can increase any of those stats to make you do more damage. What Shenhe does, right, with her Icy Quill mechanic, is instead of directly increasing a stat, she kind of adds something onto a part of the calculation. So usually, you have your character's attack, you have the motion value, or the talent multiplier, you have, let's assume it doesn't crit just to simplify it, you have the damage percent. Fuck it, let's assume it then crits, whatever. And the crit damage, right? And what it does is, let's say you have 1,000 attack, motion value, let's say it's 200%, you've got a Cryo Gauntlet, and you have 145% crit damage. What it's gonna do is it's gonna take your character's attack, it's gonna multiply it by your motion value. Then, you'll increase it based on your cryo damage. So it'll do 46% more damage. And then, if it crits, you'll increase it based on your crit damage. So it'll do 145% more damage. And that will get you to a number. What Shenhe does is she kind of has her own motion value that a different character is doing. So Shenhe has her own character attack. Let's say she has 2,500 attack, and her Icy Quill, let's say it's at like 60-ish%. Which means that you would increase your damage by 1,500. But the question is, where does that go? Does it take your number and make it exactly 1,500 bigger? No. What it does is it increases by 1,500 before your damage, before your crit. And so, a way that you can look at it is that you can think of it as damage that Shenhe is doing, that Icy Quill damage, but that instead of looking at Shenhe's stats, looks at her attack, but at a different character's damage percent, and a different character's crit. And so because of that, you build her full attack, but the Icy Quill still crits based on your Ayaka's crit rate and your Ayaka's damage percent. That's how the buff works. Because of this, right, because of the way that it works, it actually makes it so that attack becomes a little bit less valuable on those new characters. Or rather, it's not that attack becomes less valuable, it's that increasing your Ayaka's attack does not increase your Icy Quill damage. It increases your overall damage, yes, but only through Ayaka's own motion value. Whereas, if you were to increase Ayaka's crit instead, it would still increase Ayaka's own motion value, but it would also increase the Icy Quill damage, effectively making it so that crit becomes more valuable than usual, and damage percent becomes more valuable than usual. That's actually another part of why, like, Shenhe kind of ends up being an Ayaka constellation is, again, right? Vertical investment into characters, right? When you start getting the constellations or their signature weapon. With Ayaka, all of her constellations increase things that are not her attack. And her signature weapon has a passive that gives you crit damage and damage percent. All things that would also increase Icy Quill damage, which means that you'll feel the increase that Shenhe provides to your team more on those teams than on an Amenoma Ayaka that's C0. But yeah, so one thing that I talk about here and there is how Cryo characters, because of Blizzard Strayer, often reach crit damage values that are high enough that you actually end up reaching diminishing returns. And because you often don't play them with Bennett, then there are many situations and many accounts on which attack circlets can actually be better than crit circlets, depending on substats. With Shenhe, that doesn't actually happen very much, because those attack circlets do not increase Icy Quill damage, whereas the crit circlets do. But yeah, so I guess that answers the very next question, right? Is it true that pairing Ayaka with Shenhe allows her to get away with less attack percent? It's not so much get away with less attack percent as much as it is increasing the values of the stats that are not attack. How much of an obstacle do I think is her Quill's lack of scaling in AoE? It is a lack of scaling in AoE because I guess I didn't explain the trigger quota. Shenhe's Icy Quills have a trigger quota, which means that you can only activate, like, you only get up to a certain amount of them, which is 5 if you press, which you do in Ayaka teams usually, and 7 if you hold, which I guess you can do if you're trying to one-rotate in Ayaka teams, but generally you stick to press. Generally 5 per E, but it basically it makes it so that only 5 damage numbers will benefit from the Quill. When you're dealing AoE damage, you get a damage number on each enemy, which means that if you're hitting 5 enemies, then only the first hit will benefit from the Icy Quill, and then the very next hit, you're already out, right? Because you've dealt damage to 5 enemies. It's not that she loses damage, the damage is still done, but usually characters that deal damage in AoE, well, when they're doing damage in AoE, the damage goes up based on how many enemies get hit. With Shenhe's Icy Quills, that's not the case. That's just a thing that makes her scaling in AoE not necessarily the best. It's not that big of a problem because she starts from a spot where she is slightly better in single target, and she doesn't lose a massive amount because at the end of the day, yes, the Icy Quills are nice, and yes, they are an important part of her kit, but she also provides 15%, 14 at talent 9, but whatever, around 15% cryo res shred. She also provides 15 cryo damage and 15 elemental skill or burst damage, so that's another 30% damage percent. The Icy Quills is not the only thing that she provides to your team, they're just part of it. They're a big part of it, but she's not useless in AoE. She's still useful, she's still doing something, it's just not quite as useful. You also get, how many hits do you get on the burst again? Is it 12? It's 12? Okay. But yeah, and this part of her damage is AoE. Even in AoE, she's not like useless, right? But yeah. Is it ever worth holding E and are 2 tap E's per rotation even manageable or advisable for her without C1? So let's start with the second one. Are 2 tap E's per rotation even manageable or advisable for her without C1? Yes, very. If you don't do 2 tap E's per rotation, don't pull for Shenhe. Your ER is going to be down the drain if you only get 1 tap E per rotation. And also, the value she provides to the team will also be down the drain. By the way, you can check out Jamie's channel for a bunch of like rotation videos as well as showcase videos, things like that. This rotation specifically, I like it. So when you use Shenhe Burst E into Kalamity EQ, into Kogami E, into Ayaka's dash normal skill burst, and to C, swap back to Shenhe. At the moment when you swap back to Shenhe, 7.5 seconds left on the burst when we use the skill. If we look at the beginning of the rotation, 18.2, which means it's been like 10.5 seconds. You're basically almost exactly using Shenhe's E as soon as it comes back off cooldown. If you skip the charge attack or if you do N1C instead of N2C on Ayaka, you basically get it exactly off cooldown. And as you can see, your Ayaka burst is still going after your second E, meaning that not only do you A, get 2 E's in a 20-second rotation because you're using it basically exactly off cooldown, but also you're consuming all of your Icy Quills with the burst itself. The reason why they're doing QE here is because it's a 10-second cooldown. If you don't use your E basically as soon as it comes off cooldown, you're extending your rotation. If you do EQ, your E will be back off cooldown a little bit before you swap into Shenhe, which will slightly extend your rotation. The thing that's nice is you don't have to count count. It just does it by itself if you do the natural progression of you start with your Shenhe because you need to apply Cryo, then you swirl the Cryo, then you go to Kogomi because you want to TTDS your Ayaka, then you swap to Ayaka, you use your things, and then back to Shenhe and her E's back up. Another advantage that a rotation like this has is that one of the Shenhe E's is naturally batteried into Ayaka because you want to swap the Shenhe, use your E, and then back to Ayaka to fill the rest of your rotation time. And just like that, you get a 21-ish second rotation where things just line up really well. Anyways, it is manageable because, like I said, right, like the cooldown, if you just do the logical order of things, just lines up well. If you're using Mona instead of Kogomi, the cooldowns line up a little bit less well, so basically just skip the charge attack on Ayaka and you'll be more or less fine. Anyways, all this to say, yes, you should be using 2 tap E's per rotation in your Ayaka team. Is it ever worth holding E, whatever? Yes, it can be. The basic differences is that the skill tap generates 3 particles, the hold generates 4. And again, right, we're mainly talking about Ayaka teams. In other teams, then there can be more value in using the tap. But anyways, in Ayaka teams, you never want to start with your hold because you want to get the burst damage that you get from using your tap. But on that second elemental skill, after you've already used your Ayaka burst, while your Ayaka burst is going, if you know that the enemy is going to die and you won't need a second burst to kill them, well, you already have the burst damage from using the tap. You won't need to do an additional tap 10 seconds later to keep your rotation going because you won't need an additional rotation, which means that both of the downsides of using hold are gone. And then at that point, yeah, just use your hold because it's 7 quills instead of 5. But yeah, so it's really mostly to finish off enemies. How important is her burst, since it's still somewhat common to see builds which only tunnel vision towards attack percent for her quills? Unless you're playing her in the melt teams where like you just can't use her burst, not using her burst is griefing. The res shred plus the cryo damage is the very reason why she can be an upgrade over some of the other cryo characters. If you're not using her burst, why the f are you playing her? The main thing is if you're using the right weapon, you can tunnel vision on attack percent while still getting more than enough ER. Does Shenhe's A4 buff snapshot, and can Bennett's burst directly affect her quills? This buff doesn't snapshot, which means that there is still a downside to holding E instead of tapping E on the second one. It only lasts 10 seconds. So there would still be an argument to tap E. I guess with C1 you wouldn't, but yeah. My mistake then. There would still be an argument to hold if you know that it's the last rotation on the enemy, because you would finish off the enemy with normal attacks and charge attacks on Ayaka. Shenhe's A4 burst buff does not snapshot, no. It's a dynamic buff. Can Bennett's burst directly affect her quills? Yes, but only when she's on field. Shenhe's icy quills do not snapshot, which means that if you deploy all field cryo abilities and then swap and then use Bennett buff and swap to her, you can get your icy quills to benefit from Bennett's buff, but honestly it's not worth it. Artifact set overview: 4-piece noblesse versus 2-piece attack. 4-piece noblesse, and it's not even close. Because the damage that you get pre-damage and pre-crit on your Ayaka and on your icy quill, these things like are put together and then you have all the crit, and the crit is multiplying by the same amount and the damage is multiplying by the same amount. When we're comparing the impact of stats like attack percent, we can actually just ignore the crit and damage percent altogether. The thing is, attack percent on Shenhe and on Ayaka, right? It doesn't matter how much total attack you have, the amount of attack that you gain from attack percent will always be the same number based on your base attack. So we don't even need to know how much attack percent you have. We can literally just directly compare the 36% attack bonus on an Icy Quill to the 20% attack bonus on both the Icy Quill and Ayaka Burst. So the gain from 2-piece would be 36% of base attack multiplied by the motion value. On Ayaka, you'd gain nothing. Gain noblesse would be 20%, but you'd gain it on Ayaka as well. And the thing is, you get more Ayaka burst hits, even in single target, you get more Ayaka burst hits than you get Icy Quill hits. Before even looking at what can happen in AoE, the baseline amount of Icy Quills that you get is 10. Whereas with Ayaka, it's 19 plus the cutting damage, but we don't even need to include the cutting damage to show the difference. And as you can see, from using noblesse, your Icy Quill buff is a little bit smaller, right? This is the gain from the set. It's not the total ice equal number. But you're increasing Ayaka's damage by way more than what you lose out on Icy Quills. Now, if you have another character that can use Noblesse on your team, and that is using Noblesse on your team, then there's no real reason to go Noblesse on Shenhe. But otherwise, you always go Noblesse on Shenhe. It's significantly better than 2-piece. How much ER does she generally need? So that depends a lot. Worst case scenario is you can't fit a second E in your rotation because you don't have the rotation down very well yet, and you forget to swap to her at the right moment, whatever. You wouldn't get a 5 proc, and your Kazuha would be on a weapon that isn't 5. So you get 3 particles from your own E. Let's say your Ayaka gets 2 E's, right? So that's another 9 particles. Let's say 2 Kazuha E's and Kokomi, but you fuck up your burst and you don't refresh your jellyfish. Let's say 4 particles average. If your 5 doesn't proc, and again, right, we're assuming 2 Ayaka E's, and I think that if you've played Shenhe teams with Ayaka, you'll find that if you're not paying too close attention to your rotation, it might be difficult to get 2 Ayaka E's. But that's fine. ER requirements would be 240. Now, obviously, like I said, that's worst case scenario. A more realistic case is you do the rotation properly. So you don't catch her own skill, but you do get 2 skills. Still get 2 Ayaka E's, but this time your 5 is proccing. And your Kazuha is on 5. That's better. 187, that's achievable with the 36.5 from 5 plus 15 substats. But because you don't need crit damage and you only need enough crit rate to proc your 5, then ER substats don't hurt your overall output as much as other characters get hurt by it, because you don't care that much about flat attack, because it really doesn't do that much. And you already have attack percent as your main stat. And then you'd have the best case scenario where you have a high refined 5 on both her and Kazuha, and they both proc it on each elemental skill. So instead of getting 2 5 procs in your rotation, you get a total of 4, 2 on Shenhe and 2 on Kazuha. And you kill the enemies a little bit faster, so you get a little bit more HP particles. And then you'd only basically need 20% ER from your substats after the 30.6. My bad. You'd still about 25% above the 30%, above the 30.6 that you get from 5. And so, her ER requirements generally hover in the range between 150-ish and 250-ish. 250-ish is really worst case, but the main thing to keep in mind is that while the worst case won't be what happens often, it is a thing that will happen to almost everyone once in a while. Because the enemy died right as they used their skill, so it didn't hit. Or the enemy decided to dodge your skill by jumping, or any such problems that can cause your skill to just miss and things to feel like shit. My point with this is basically just, you can get away with low ER in some situations, but going at least for the realistic case, even when you have a good amount of particle generation from a high refined 5 or something like that, is something that I would still advise. Weapon overview. Out of her weapons, free to play 4 and 5 stars stack against each other. Favonius. Favd. I'm not actually sure what her best free-to-play option if you don't have Fav is nowadays. I guess it would probably be the Missive Windspear, right? Either Missive Windspear or Prototype Star Glitter, depending on if you have an attack sans with high ER or an ER sans with high attack, I guess. Basically, if you have Fav, use Fav. If you have Calamity Queller, you can use it over Fav, and it will do more damage, but you'll need really, really high artifact investment on your Shenhe to reach her own ER requirements. And unless you're one-rotating enemies, the higher ER Rex on your Ayaka will make it so that the difference is actually not even very big. So it's not a weapon that I would recommend getting, but if you have it, it can be better. But like basically at that point, I'd rather have Ayaka's C1 than Calamity Queller for Shenhe instead of Fav. Other 5-star weapons are not worth it. Just use Fav. Like, just use Fav, please. How does Shenhe skew Ayaka's weapon rankings? Basically, any weapon with crit or with damage percent benefits from the Icy Quills more. But weapons with attack percent benefit from Shenhe's Ascension passives that give you damage percent more than damage percent weapons. All in all, the biggest winners are crit weapons, and then damage weapons, and then attack weapons. How good is Calamity Queller as a pull? It's probably the worst signature weapon as a pull. I'm an Aqua hater, but Aqua f***ing solos Calamity Queller. Like, it can be a fine weapon on Xiao, I guess, but like on Shenhe, it's a situational slight increase to the slight increase that you get from the Icy. It's like it's an incredibly marginal pull, basically. It's not bad, like it is an increase in the right situations, but it's a very, very marginal increase. And obviously, yeah, like if you start looking at like whale level investment stuff, then things can change. But I'm talking for like the average player. If you are a whale and you want to rotate stuff, then sure, her weapon can be okay, because you don't need the ER if you want to rotate. If you get this as well, right, the Icy Quill becomes a much bigger portion of what you get when you play her with normal attackers and all that, but whatever. Constellation Overview, how good are her constellations and how impactful / worth are her 2 constellations? Okay, C1 gives her E1 more charge. It's more of a quality of life thing. It's not actually that good. It just kind of makes her rotations easier to play. It helps front load your damage also, because you can basically get 3 E's on your first Ayaka burst instead of only 2. Above average when it comes to constellations that give you an extra use of a skill, but constellations that give you an extra use of a skill are not usually the greatest. The C2 is kind of nice. Increases her personal damage a little bit, increases the duration and like uptime on the res shred, gives a little bit crit damage. So overall, like, it's nice. You can think of this as Ayaka's C6, I guess, because Ayaka's cons after C4 are so shit. So then after that, instead of getting her C6, you can get C2 Shenhe or whatever. I don't know, man. It's nice, but it's not great. It's not like insane. C3 is fine. Like it's okay. C4, honestly, I don't remember. I did some math on it when she came out, but I fucking forwore. But yeah, this fucking sucks. Okay, cool. The C5 also kind of sucks. You don't even get additional res decrease if she's already crowned. It's just a little bit more personal damage, which like is a joke. And then C6 Shenhe is kind of a weird constellation because it's actually not that good in her good teams, because in her good teams you're using skills and bursts, but it's like if you put her with Chongyun, her C6 can make any melee character actually pretty decent. It's really weird. Yeah, C6 Shenhe fixes Daya, true. Like, C6 Shenhe is the best Daya team for sure. It's the best carry Daya team. But yeah, like all in all, it's not a great constellation, but it is situationally very useful. But yeah, all in all, her cons suck. Can you suggest some gimmicky fun stuff that her C6 helps facilitate? Honestly, Zhongli carry. If you get her C6, play Cryo Zhongli. You'll have a blast. Like freeze Zhongli. Try to make your pillar not hit the enemy. But yeah, for the same reason why Zhongli's a very good Crescent Pike user, he's got fast attacks with multi-hits, then he's also a very good Shenhe C6 user. You wouldn't want to play both at once though, because like obviously Crescent Pike is physical damage, and that doesn't synergize well with the cryo damage stuff. But yeah. Team overview, freeze versus melt versus mono cryo. How good is mono cryo against freeze resistant content compared to just brute forcing a freeze team? And how well does she slot in said archetype if the carry is someone like Rosaria, Kaeya instead? I mean, I've mostly covered like Shenhe and like freeze and melt teams with Ayaka and Ganyu. With other characters, if you don't have Ayaka or Ganyu, she works, but I don't think she's a very valuable pull to improve like a Rev Melt quick swap team with Bennett Chengling, Rosaria, Kaeya, for example. It's not significant enough of an increase, in my opinion, to warrant the pull. And then, okay, Mono Cryo, she is a very good unit for Mono Cryo. Mono Cryo is overall because freeze is so broken as a reaction, but obviously freeze doesn't work against enemies, which is where Mono Cryo's value lies. And she is actually quite good for Mono Cryo teams because instead of buffing up to 3 characters, one of which doesn't have cryo damage, right? Because usually, right, you play her in freeze teams, you have your cryo carry, you have herself, right? So the cryo carry can get Icy Quills, she can get Icy Quills, but she's not building a lot of crit or damage. And then your animal unit can get Icy Quills, but they're also not building a bunch of cryo damage or crit because most of the time they're built for EM. In Mono Cryo, instead of the third unit being a unit that just doesn't do cryo damage and benefit from the Icy Quill buff at all, it's a unit that does, and then also is building damage and crit, which makes her value in those teams skyrocket, right? Instead of it buffing basically a character that is actively building for the Icy Quill damage to be relevant, and then 2 characters who aren't building for the Icy Quill damage that much, which is herself, not much crit, not much damage per se, and the animal unit. It's now 2 characters who are building stats that improve Icy Quill damage a lot, and 2 characters that are building stats that increase Icy Quill damage a decent amount. Basically, it makes the amount she provides to the team higher. Does she have any unconventional comps and build, like, say, Hyperfridge Shenhe, and is there a place for her as solo cryo and other archetypes? Basically, no, but yes. Like, can you use her in Hyperfridge? Sure. You can use any cryo characters in Hyperfridge. Does she bring something to Hyperfridge that makes her better than basically any other cryo character? No. Her application isn't particularly fast, the uptime on it isn't particularly good, and her personal damage isn't great. If you're playing her without another cryo unit, she's just not a very good unit to have on your team. She doesn't really have good unconventional comps. I mean, you can just on-field her with Chongyun, I guess, like, sure, it's not particularly good, but like, sure, why not? Have fun. A bit of a rare question. For a team centered around Freeze, Aloy, yes, really, would Shenhe or Yunjin be the better support of the two? The thing about Aloy is that her cryo infusion on normal attack is dependent on getting 4 stacks of coil, but because there's an ICD on gaining stat, it's not even an ICD, because there's a cooldown on gaining stacks of coil, very often you'll use your E, and then you just won't get the infusion. Because of that, because half the time you're playing physical, Yunjin's probably better, because she actually buffs you when you're doing physical damage. If things go right, I'm not actually sure, but really, why not both at that point? I mean, Shenhe's probably better overall because you're also getting that cryo res shred and you're batterying and you don't have to worry about Yunjin insane ER requirements if you're playing her solo Geo, and you're getting cryo resonance, or if you already have cryo resonance, you're buffing your other cryo unit on top of your Aloy. Like, the more I think about it, the more, yeah, Shenhe's just going to be doing more. With the last few Abyss rotations really screwing over cryo one way or another, is investing into a cryo team still as worthwhile as it once was? I guess kind of not really, but I think that a bigger factor into it is not the recent Abyss rotations being bad for cryo as much as it is Dendro teams good. Dendro teams very easy 36 star. If want clear, play Dendro. Freeze will always be Freeze. When you're against enemies that can actually kill you and they're not unfreezable, Freeze will be so much more comfortable to clear with than other teams. That does it for the Ask Zajef Shenhe edition. I hope you enjoyed the video. Check me out on Twitch where I totally don't procrastinate on doing these videos. Leave a like, leave a comment. I want you to say bowl in the comments, like bowl of soup. If your comment is anything other than bowl, go edit it to bowl right now. But thank you for watching, YouTube. Hope you all have a nice one, and I'll see you next time.
Unleash! Transfiguration! By ordinance divine! Cryo incarnate! Do your master's bidding!
This is probably one of my worst ones. Jesus.
命ずる魂よ念の表像天神直送律令に従え
Let's see the Korean one.
神
Maybe not.